12 chairs scraped against the hardwood floor of the Vineyard Hall at the exact same moment. The sound was sharp and sudden, like a single crack of thunder inside a quiet room. The string quartet faltered mid-phrase, the cellist losing her bow position, the violins trailing off into silence. Conversations died in the middle of sentences. Wine glasses paused halfway to lips. Then a voice rang out from somewhere near the center of the room, clear and unhesitating and unmistakable. "General on deck." 12 hands rose in perfect unison. 12 men and women, some in dark suits, some in evening dresses, all of them standing at attention with the kind of stillness that only years of training can produce. The entire wedding hall froze. 120 guests turned in the same direction, following the line of those 12 raised hands toward a single figure standing near the entrance of the room. My mother Patricia covered her mouth with both hands. My father James stared as though he were seeing someone he had never met before. My younger sister Cooper, still radiant in her wedding gown, went completely still beside the man she had just married, her bouquet held loosely at her side. Her eyes wide and bright and filling with something she could not quite name. And somewhere behind me, a champagne flute hit the marble floor. The sound of it shattering was the only noise in that entire hall for 3 full seconds. All of it happened in less than 10 seconds. 10 seconds that changed the way my family understood who I was, and who I had always been. But the truth is, that moment did not begin in a vineyard hall in Virginia. It began with a phone call. 1 month earlier, on a quiet afternoon in North Carolina, I was sitting on the back steps of my small house outside Jacksonville, about 12 minutes from Camp Lejeune, when my phone rang. It was late October, the kind of afternoon that could not decide if it was still fall or already winter. The sky was the pale gray of old pewter, and the pine trees at the edge of my yard stood perfectly still. I had a cup of coffee on the step beside me and a folder of retirement paperwork spread open across my knees. 29 years in the United States Marine Corps, and I was preparing to close the chapter. I looked at the caller ID. Dad. When your father is 72 years old and calling in the middle of a weekday afternoon, you answer on the first ring. I have always answered on the first ring. "Hey, Dad," his voice came through carefully, the way it always does when he is building up to something. We talked for a few minutes about ordinary things. The weather in Lima, Ohio. Whether the Browns had any chance this season. The neighbor's oak tree that had dropped half its branches across his driveway in a windstorm. My father is a man who approaches difficult conversations the way someone approaches a cold swimming pool, circling the edge, testing the temperature, hoping to find a spot that feels less abrupt. Finally, he said it. "Martha, honey. I wanted to talk to you about Cooper's wedding." I set my coffee down on the step. "Of course," I said. "I already have the flight booked." "Oh, good, good," he paused. There was a softness in his voice that I recognized, the softness of a man carrying someone else's message. "Cooper was wondering," he began, and then he stopped again. "She was just hoping that maybe, with the venue being what it is and Emily's family coming from Connecticut and all." I waited. "She thought maybe you might not wear your uniform." I looked out at the pine trees. The wind had started up a little, moving the tops of them in slow, patient arcs. I had heard those words before, in different forms from different people, across nearly 3 decades. But hearing them from my father on a quiet Tuesday afternoon with my retirement papers in my lap, they landed differently than I expected. "Is that what she said?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. "You know how weddings are," he said. "It is a very elegant event. The venue is a vineyard, very formal. Emily has a lot of friends from the city, from her work, and Cooper just thought," he trailed off. "She thought the uniform would make people uncomfortable." He exhaled slowly. "She doesn't want anything that draws too much attention." That is all she said. I picked up my coffee and held it in both hands, feeling the warmth of the mug. "Dad," I said, "when Cooper's car broke down in Columbus 3 years ago at 2 a.m, who drove 4 hours to get her?" He did not answer. "When your knee surgery left you on the couch for 6 weeks and the gutters needed cleaning before the first snow, who came home and did it?" Still nothing. "When Mom needed those tests in Cleveland and you didn't want to drive the highway alone, who took the week off?" "Martha," he said quietly. "I didn't do any of those things in a cocktail dress." "Dad." There was a long silence on the line. Then he said something that surprised me, not because of what it was, but because of how tired he sounded when he said it. I know that, Martha, I know. Cooper asked me to call. I understand, I told him. She just doesn't want the day to be about anything other than her and Greg. I stared at the retirement folder in my lap. All those forms, all those signatures. The end of a life that most people in my family had never once asked me to describe in detail. I'll be there, I said. I wouldn't miss her wedding. I know you wouldn't and I'll be respectful, I always am. Another pause. I was hoping you'd say something like that, he said, though his voice suggested he had been hoping I would say something else entirely. We talked for a few more minutes, but the warmth had gone out of the conversation the way heat leaves a room when the door is left open too long. Before he hung up, he said goodbye 3 times. The way he does when he feels guilty about something. I sat on those back steps for a long time after the call ended. The pine trees went still again. The coffee went cold. Then I stood up, walked inside, and opened the closet in the hallway. My Marine Corps dress blues hung in a garment bag near the back. I unzipped it slowly. The deep navy fabric caught the afternoon light coming through the window. Red piping along the sleeves. Rows of ribbons and decorations, each one a chapter of a story my family had never read. And on the shoulders, 2 silver stars. Brigadier General Martha Sullivan. I ran my hand across the fabric for a long moment. Then I smiled at the empty room. Well, I said quietly, looks like you are going to a wedding. I was not always General Sullivan. For the first 17 years of my life, I was just Martha, the older Carter girl who could not sit still in church, and who spent her Saturday mornings in the garage instead of at the mall with the other girls from school. I grew up in Lima, Ohio, a town of factories and cornfields and people who believed, genuinely and without apology, that life followed a clear and sensible script. My father James worked at the post office for 31 years. My mother Patricia taught 2nd grade at Jefferson Elementary. And my sister Cooper, 7 years younger than me, was the kind of child who made strangers stop and smile on the sidewalk. Soft curls, easy laugh, the kind of sweetness that seemed entirely natural and entirely effortless. She was the child my parents had pictured when they pictured children. And then there was me. I took apart lawnmowers. I read military history books from the public library and kept a map of the Pacific Theater taped to my bedroom wall. By the time I was 13, I could identify the difference between a Spitfire and a Thunderbolt from a single photograph. By 15, I had taught myself basic car maintenance from a manual I found at a garage sale. My father would come into the garage and find me elbow deep in something mechanical and stand there with his arms crossed, not quite knowing what expression to use. One afternoon he said, "Martha, your sister is in there baking cookies with your mother." "I know," I told him. I wiped a streak of grease from my forearm. "This carburetor is going to clean itself." He opened his mouth, then closed it, then went back inside. The truth is, I think my father loved me in all the ways he knew how. He just did not know very many ways, and the ways he did know were built for a different kind of daughter. The first time I told my family I wanted to join the Marines, I was 17 years old. It was a Sunday dinner in November. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans from a can. Cooper was 10, sitting across from me, kicking her feet against the rungs of her chair. I put down my fork and said it plainly. The way I have always said difficult things. "I talked to a Marine recruiter on Friday. I think I want to enlist." The table went very quiet. Cooper stopped kicking her feet. My mother looked at my father. My father set down his fork with a deliberateness that I recognized even then as the silence before a firm and final verdict. "Martha," he said, "the Marines are for men." He said it the way people say things they have never once questioned, the way people repeat sentences they absorb somewhere along the way without ever holding them up to the light. I looked at my plate, but I did not change my mind. 2 years later, I left for officer candidate school in Quantico, Virginia. My mother cried at the airport quietly, the way she cries about everything, with one hand pressed flat against her sternum as though she is trying to keep something from escaping. My father shook my hand. Firm, brief, like a business transaction. Cooper was 17 by then, old enough to understand what was happening, but she stood at the edge of the farewell with her arms crossed and her eyes uncertain, as if she had not yet decided how to feel about losing the sister she had never quite figured out. None of them said they were proud. Officer candidate school was the hardest thing I had ever done, and the most clarifying. Virginia mud at 4 in the morning. Obstacle courses designed to find the exact edge of what a person can endure and then push past it. Leadership exercises, where every mistake was examined and catalogued and handed back to you the next morning like evidence. And for a young woman in the early 1990s, there was an additional layer to everything. An invisible test running alongside all the visible ones. Half the people in that room were waiting to see if I would fold. I did not fold. One of my instructors stopped in front of me during the first week of training. He looked at me for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "Sullivan, you have to be twice as ready, twice as steady, and half as loud." He was not trying to discourage me. He was telling me the truth about the world I was entering. I wrote those words in my notebook that night. I read them again 29 years later, the morning I packed my dress uniform for a wedding in Virginia. There were 31 women in my OCS class. By graduation, there were 19. The ones who left were not weak people. Some of them were extraordinary people who had simply reached a wall they could not climb on that particular day. I thought about each of them often over the years, when the walls I faced were political rather than physical, when the obstacle was a room full of people who had already decided what I was capable of before I opened my mouth. The women who left off taught me something important without meaning to. They taught me that the hardest walls are not made of mud and rope. They are made of other people, as certainty about your limitations. I commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps on a Friday afternoon in June, in a ceremony attended by approximately 200 people, none of whom were my family. A woman named Captain Diane Ferraro shook my hand at the end of the line and said, "Lieutenant Sullivan, the Corps got a good one today." I have carried that sentence with me for 30 years. Some words have a longer life than others. The promotions came one at a time, each one earned and each one announced to my family with the same result. Second lieutenant became first, lieutenant became captain. I called home from Okinawa to tell my parents about captain. My mother said, "That is wonderful, honey. Are you eating enough?" My father said. "Good job," my sister Cooper, 19 by then and just starting community college, said. "Does that mean more money?" It probably did, I told her. "Cool," she said, and asked if she could call me back because her show was on. Years pass the way. Years pass when you are too busy to count them. Major, lieutenant colonel, deployments to places most people only read about in newspapers. If they read about them at all, I led Marines through situations where the distance between the right decision and the wrong one was measured in human lives. I buried colleagues I had known for decades. I wrote letters to families I had never met to tell them what their sons and daughters had meant to the men and women who served beside them. Every time I called home, my parents were polite and warm and entirely unchanged. My father asked about the weather wherever I was stationed. My mother asked about my health. Cooper sent occasional texts, short and affectionate and entirely disconnected from the details of my life. "How are you, sis? Miss you. Call me sometime." I always called back. The conversations were pleasant and shallow, and left me feeling like I was standing on the other side of a very clean window. The day I pinned on my first star, I invited my parents to the ceremony. My mother said the church calendar was full that month. My father said the post office was staffed. Cooper said she had just started a new job and couldn't take time off. The only people standing with me when the commandant placed that first star on my shoulder were Marines. Men and women who had served beside me for years, who had earned the right to be in that room through something that cannot be inherited or given. Afterward, a master sergeant who had known me since I was a captain came up and said, I hope your people understand what this means." I nodded and told him thank you. But I knew, even as I said it, that understanding was not something I could give them. It had to be earned in a different way entirely. I called my parents that evening. My mother said, "Oh, Martha, that is so nice." My father said, "Well done." Then he asked if the new title came with better housing. 29 years. And still, somehow, a stranger in my own family's house. The morning of Cooper's wedding was one of those early November days in Virginia that cannot quite commit to any particular weather. I woke up in a hotel room in Charlottesville just before 6. The light outside the window, the pale gray of an uncertain sky. For a moment I lay still and listened to the distant sound of the city waking up. Trucks on the road, a bird somewhere below the window, the hum of the hotel's heating system. I showered and made coffee with the small machine on the dresser. Then I opened the closet. The dress uniform hung exactly as I had packed it, pressed and precise and patient. I stood in front of it for a long moment with my coffee in one hand. There is something that people who have never worn a military uniform do not fully understand about what it means. It is not vanity and it is not ceremony for its own sake. Every ribbon on that chest is a record. Every decoration tells a story, and not all of those stories are ones you would choose to remember. But all of them are ones you carry anyway. When you put on that uniform, you are not only putting on your own history, you are putting on the history of every person who wore it before you, and the responsibility of every person who will wear it after. I set my coffee down and began to dress. The coat first, dark navy, perfectly fitted, the trousers with their precise crease, the white gloves, then the decorations, each one placed exactly as protocol requires, and last, the shoulder boards with their 2 silver stars. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked at myself for a long moment. Then I picked up my officer's cap, tucked it under my arm, and said to my reflection, "Well, General, let's go meet the family." The vineyard was about 20 minutes from the hotel, up through winding roads where the autumn had done its full work on the trees. Orange and deep red and gold along the hillsides, old stone fences, farmhouses set back from the road. It reminded me of the countryside outside Lima when I was small. Those long drives my family used to take on Sunday afternoons when my father was in a generous mood. I parked in the back of the gravel lot and sat in the car for a moment. Through the windshield I could see guests moving toward the venue entrance. Men in dark suits, women in fall colors, the quiet pageantry of a well-planned wedding on a clear afternoon. The vineyard estate was beautiful in the way that places are beautiful when someone has thought very carefully about every detail. White tents along the stone terrace, rows of grapevines stretching away across the golden hills. Everything elegant and composed and deliberate. I stepped out of the car and adjusted my coat. The first thing I noticed when I walked inside was the string quartet near the front of the hall, playing something soft and measured. The second thing I noticed was the room going fractionally quieter as I moved through it. Heads turned. A man near the entrance did a small double take. 2 women at a nearby table paused mid-conversation and looked up. Military dress uniforms do that. Especially this one. My mother found me before I had made it 20 feet into the room. She came across the floor quickly, in the hurrying walk she uses when she is alarmed, but trying not to appear alarmed. She was wearing a pale blue dress and her good pearl earrings, and she looked lovely in the way that mothers always look lovely at their children's weddings, a little overwhelmed and a little radiant at the same time. "Martha," she said, stopping in front of me and dropping her voice. "You wore it." I gave her a small smile. "Hello, Mom." She glanced around the room, taking a quick inventory of who was watching. "People are looking." I looked around too calmly. "They usually do." She pressed her lips together in the way she does when she wants to say something more but has decided against it. Then she leaned slightly closer. "Your father is over by the bar. He is already worried. I'll find him." She hesitated. "Cooper, doesn't he know yet that you are here?" She said the words carefully, the way people say things they hope will function as warnings. "It is her wedding, Mom. She'll see me eventually." My mother studied me for a moment with an expression I have spent my whole life trying to decode. It was not exactly disapproval and not exactly pride and not exactly worry, but something in the neighborhood of all 3 at once. Then she squeezed my arm very briefly and went back to the table where she had been sitting with Cooper. Laws. My father was indeed near the bar, holding a glass of champagne and speaking with a man I did not recognize. When he saw me, his expression went through 3 distinct phases in about 2 seconds. Recognition, discomfort. Then something flatter and harder to name. The look of a man recalibrating a situation he had expected to have more control over. He excused himself and walked over. "Martha, Dad, you look well." He looked at the uniform, at the stars on my shoulders. Then back at my face. "People are already talking," he said. "I know," his voice dropped. "Martha, we talked about this." "You talked about it," I told him, and I kept my voice gentle because I meant to. You and Cooper talked about it. I listened, and I am here. He exhaled through his nose. The champagne glass turned once in his hand. You always were stubborn. Yes, I said. That helped. He looked at me for another moment, and in that look I could see the whole long complicated history of us. The father who had not known what to do with the daughter who didn't fit the script, and the daughter who had gone and written her own. Then he shook his head slightly and went back to his conversation, and I walked to the edge of the room and stood quietly with a glass of water, watching the hall fill. I had been standing there for perhaps 10 minutes when Cooper appeared. She came through a side door with her maid of honor, her dress the kind of ivory white that photographs as though light is coming from inside it. She was 28 years old, and she looked beautiful and nervous in equal measure. She saw me almost immediately, and I watched the nervousness climb in her face before she could stop it. She said something to her maid of honor and came across the room. We stood facing each other for a moment, two sisters with 29 years of separate lives between us. "Martha," she said. Her voice was careful. "You look beautiful, Cooper. You really do." She looked at the uniform, at the decorations, at the stars. Then she looked back at my face. "Can we talk for a second?" She nodded toward the side hallway, away from the crowd. We stepped into the corridor. It was quieter there, just the muffled sound of the quartet and the hum of guests settling into their seats. "I just didn't want today to be about you," she said. She said it directly, which I respected. She has always been more direct than she lets on. "It won't be about me," I told her. "It never is." She crossed her arms and looked at the floor. "Martha, I don't even know what those things mean." I gestured toward the decorations on my chest. She shook her head slowly. "That is kind of the point, isn't it?" We stood in the corridor for another moment. Then I said, "Go get married, Cooper. I am proud of you." She looked up at me, and something moved across her face, something unresolved and complicated and very old. She went back to the hall. I followed a few moments later, found a seat toward the side of the room, and settled in to watch my sister get married. The ceremony was held outside on the stone terrace, beneath a wooden arch threaded with white flowers and autumn branches. Cooper and Greg stood facing each other in the golden late afternoon, light with the vineyard hills rolling away behind them, and the whole scene had the quality of something you might find in a painting, composed and still and larger than the individual moments that made it up. Cooper cried during the vows, which I had expected. Greg cried too, which I had not, and it made me like him more. I sat in the back row between two guests I did not know, and I watched my little sister become a wife. And I felt the complicated warmth of that. When the ceremony ended, the guests moved back inside for the reception. The string quartet resumed. Wine was poured. The hall filled with the particular music of a wedding at full celebration, laughter and conversation and the sound of chairs scraping back and forth, glasses touching. I found my table near the side of the room and sat quietly, speaking briefly with the guests nearby, keeping mostly to myself. I had been at the reception for perhaps 40 minutes when it happened. I noticed him first because of the way he stood up. He was seated at a table near the center of the room, a man in his mid-30s in a dark navy suit, broad through the shoulders in the way that people who have carried a great deal of weight for many years tend to be. He had been in the middle of a conversation with a woman beside him. Then his eyes crossed the room and found my shoulders, found the 2 silver stars on my dress coat, and something in his face shifted the way a compass shifts when it finds north. He put his napkin on the table. He pushed back his chair. He stood up. The woman beside him looked up confused. Then the man to his right looked over and followed his gaze and stood up too. Then across the room another man rose from his chair without speaking, his eyes already fixed on the same point. Then 2 more at a table near the window. Then another near the door. One by one, then 2 by 2, 12 men and women around the room rose to their feet with the same quiet, unhurried certainty, each one having done the math in an instant and arrived at the same answer. 12 chairs scraped the hardwood floor. The string quartet faltered. Conversations died. The man in the navy suit, Staff Sergeant Kowalski, as I would learn later, Greg's cousin, a man I had never met in my life, drew himself to full attention. His voice carried easily across the silent room. "General on deck." 12 hands rose in perfect unison. The entire hall went still. I stood up from my chair slowly. I looked across the room at those 12 faces, some familiar, one or two I recognized from years ago, most of them strangers, but every single one of them reading the same language, wearing the same invisible uniform beneath their wedding clothes. Speaking in the only dialect that does not require translation. I held their gaze for a moment. Then I brought my hand to the brim of my cap. Carry on. 12 hands came down at once. 12 people settled back into their chairs. The room held its breath for another 3 seconds. Then someone near the back began to clap. A single pair of hands, then another. Then the applause spread quietly through the hall. Not the loud celebratory kind, but the measured kind. The kind that means something. I sat back down across the room. My father's champagne glass was on the floor. A server was already moving toward it. My mother had both hands over her mouth. Cooper stood frozen beside Greg, her bouquet hanging at her side. Her eyes very bright. And my father, my 72-year-old father who had worked at the post office in Lima, Ohio for 3 decades and who had told his 17-year-old daughter that the Marines were for men, was staring at me as though the room had just explained something to him that he had spent 29 years misunderstanding. The next hour moved differently than the hour before it. The first person to approach my table was a man in his 70s, walking with the careful deliberateness of old injuries. He wore a plain dark suit and a small pin on his lapel that I recognized from across the room. He stopped beside my chair and did not say much. He extended his hand. "Vietnam," he said quietly. "1st Infantry Division." I stood immediately and shook it. We looked at each other for a moment in the way that veterans sometimes look at each other, without needing to explain very much. "Thank you for your service," I told him. He shook his head slightly. "Thank you for yours, General." He sat down in the empty chair beside me without being invited, which I took as the highest form of compliment. We talked for perhaps 15 minutes, about the places he had been, about the particular difficulty of coming home from a war that the country had complicated feelings about his sons, both of whom had served, one in the Navy and one in the Army National Guard, and how proud he was of them, and how he wished he had told them more clearly when they were young. He said, "I always assumed they knew. I told him that people rarely know unless you tell them." He nodded at that, slowly, the way people nod when they recognize something they have been carrying for a long time. After that, the conversations came in a steady, gentle stream. A retired Navy officer who had heard the call and stood from across the room. A young woman no older than 22, who approached me with wide eyes and said, "Are you really a general?" I told her I was. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't know women could do that." I looked at her for a moment. "Now you do," I said. She nodded, slowly, as though she was filing the information somewhere important. She stayed at the edge of my table for another 10 minutes, asking careful questions, the kind of questions that come from genuine curiosity rather than politeness. By the time she left, she had the business card of one of the Marine captains who had been seated nearby, and she was asking about officer candidate school with the specific hunger of someone who has just discovered that a door exists which they did not know was there. An older couple stopped by to tell me their son was stationed at Camp Pendleton. A man who had served in the Gulf told me he had always wanted to meet a female general and apologized for never having thought to look one up. A woman whose husband had died at 43 from injuries sustained overseas squeezed my hand without a word and held it for a long moment before moving on. One woman stopped and told me that her daughter had wanted to join the military years ago and she had talked her out of it because she was afraid. Her voice carried the particular weight of a decision she had been reconsidering for a long time. I looked at her carefully. "How old is your daughter now?" 31, she said. "Tell her it is not too late," I said. The woman looked at me for a long moment. Then she took a breath and nodded. Then she went back to her table and I watched her pick up her phone. Normal American life, showing up the way it always does when the conditions are right. People who wanted to say thank you and had simply never had the occasion before. People who did not know what they felt until they felt it. Which is most people, most of the time. Greg came over midway through the evening. Cooper's new husband, still in his wedding suit, his tie loosened now and his expression carrying the particular quality of a man who has just learned something important about himself. He sat down across from me without asking, which I appreciated. "General Sullivan," he said, I owe you an apology. You don't need to call me General, I told him. Martha is fine. He shook his head. I didn't know, he said. About the phone call. About what Cooper asked your father to say. He rubbed the back of his neck, she told me tonight. After I would never have. He stopped. I didn't know, he said again. It is all right. No, he said firmly. It isn't. He looked at the medals on my coat. Kowalski is my cousin. He served 6 years. He started shaking his head almost before I finished the sentence. He told me afterward that he almost didn't recognize you because of the dress code, the formal event, everyone in civilian clothes. Then he saw the stars and he just knew. He shook his head slowly. He said he served under a Colonel Sullivan once, about 12 years ago. I thought for a moment. Lejeune, I said. 2012. That is the one. He said she was the best commanding officer he ever had. I looked across the room to where Kowalski was standing near the bar, a glass in hand, talking with 2 men I did not know. He caught my eye and gave a small nod. He is a good man, I said. Greg nodded. He looked at me steadily. Martha, I don't know what was going on before tonight in your family. I can guess a little from things Cooper has said over the years, but I want you to know you'll always be welcome at our table. He said it simply, without decoration. Thank you, Greg. Congratulations on your marriage. He stood, straightened his jacket, and went back to find his wife. I stepped outside onto the terrace a little before 9 o'clock. The night had come down fully over the vineyard, and the air was the clean, sharp cold of Virginia in November. The grapevines disappeared into the darkness in long parallel lines, and somewhere beyond them the hills were only a deeper shade of black against the sky. String lights along the terrace railing threw a warm, unsteady light over the stone. I stood at the railing and breathed. I heard the door open behind me. I did not need to turn to know who it was. There are some footsteps you spend your whole life learning. My father came to stand beside me at the railing. For a while neither of us spoke. That has always been our way. We have never been people who rush toward things. Finally, he said, I've been out here 3 times tonight trying to figure out what to say. I looked over at him. He was staring out at the darkness of the vineyard, his hands resting on the railing, his champagne glass long since replaced and now forgotten somewhere inside. You don't have to say anything, Dad. Yes, I do. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, when those men and women stood up tonight, I didn't understand it at first. I thought maybe it was some kind of military custom, something ceremonial, the kind of thing you do at events. He shook his head. But then I watched the room after. I watched people come to your table, one after another. People I've never met. People who don't know us, don't know Lima, don't know anything about our family. He stopped. What did you see? I asked. He turned to look at me. They looked at you the way people look at someone who has earned something real. I waited. I spent 29 years telling myself you were off doing your thing, he said. That you had chosen a different life. That it was fine, that we were proud, that we understood. But tonight I realized something. He paused. I never actually asked what your thing was. The string lights moved in a slight breeze. I thought you were trying to prove something, he continued. To me, to the town. To everyone who ever told you that it wasn't tea for you. And maybe at the beginning you were. But somewhere along the way you stopped proving anything. He looked at the stars on my shoulders. Those men stood up tonight because of who you are, not because of what you were trying to show anyone. He shook his head slowly. That took a long time to build, Martha. Didn't it? Yes, I wasn't there for any of it. He let out a long, slow breath. The vineyard was very quiet. When you left for Quantico, he said, I shook your hand at the airport. I've thought about that a lot over the years. A handshake, he shook his head. You were 19 years old. You were going off to do something most grown men couldn't do. And I shook your hand. Dad, I should have been there, he said. When they pinned those stars on you, I should have been in that room. I turned and looked at him fully, this old man with his careful hands and his post office posture and the life he had built inside a small Ohio town, and I thought about all the years and all the distances between us, and I thought about how long it takes for people to cross the distances they have spent years creating. You are here now, I said. He turned to look at me. His eyes were wet. I am sorry, Martha. For all of it. 3 words that I had waited for my entire adult life. Not in any dramatic or aching way, not in the way of people who build resentments into monuments, but in the quiet, persistent way of someone who has simply always hoped that understanding was still possible. I placed my hand over his on the railing. "I know, Dad," I said. "I know." We stood there together for a while longer, looking out at the dark vineyard, saying nothing more because nothing more was needed. The music from inside the hall drifted out through the open door, something slow and old, the kind of song that belongs to every generation at once. Cooper found me 15 minutes after my father went back inside. She had changed out of her wedding gown into a simple white dress, and her hair was down now, and her face was softer than it had been all evening. The careful composure of a bride on display replaced by something more like the Cooper I remembered from when she was young. The 10-year-old at the dinner table who had not understood what it meant when her sister said she wanted to join the Marines. The 17-year-old at the airport who had stood at the edge of the goodbye with her arms crossed, and her eyes uncertain, too young to know what she was watching, leave and too proud to say she was not ready for it to go. She came to the railing where I was still standing, and she stood there beside me without speaking for a moment, looking out at the same dark vineyard our father had just turned away from. The music inside the hall was winding down. A few guests had come out onto the terrace and stood in small groups with their final glasses of wine, talking quietly. Cooper and I stood apart from them, close enough to each other that our shoulders nearly touched. "I owe you an apology," she said. I turned to look at her for the phone call. "For asking Dad to make it. For what I said inside about not wanting the day to be about you, Cooper." She shook her head. "No, let me say it." She took a breath. I was embarrassed. And I knew it was wrong even at the time, but I did it anyway, because I didn't know how to explain to Emily's family, or to Greg's people, or to anyone who might ask. I just didn't know how to explain who you were. She stopped. "Because I don't know who you are." She said it quietly, and it landed with a gentleness that was more devastating than any accusation could have been. I looked at her. "I know you're my sister," she said. "I know you're in the Marines. We're in the Marines. I know you're important. I've always known that. I just never knew what it meant." She paused. "I think I was afraid that if I asked, you'd tell me things I couldn't understand, or things that would make me feel guilty for all the times I didn't call." I was quiet for a moment. "You could have called," I said. "I know, any of those times. I know." She looked down at her hands, turning her new wedding ring slowly. "I kept thinking I'd do it when things settled down. When work was less busy, when I felt ready. And then years went by." She looked up at the dark vineyard. "How does that happen?" "I've asked myself the same question about other things," I told her. "The years have a way of going without asking." She nodded. "After tonight, after seeing all those people at your table, after Kowalski told Greg about serving under you." I asked Greg what Kowalski had said, about what kind of commanding officer you were. She looked up at me. "He said that in 12 years of service he never once questioned a decision you made. He said he would have followed you anywhere." She shook her head slightly. "Martha, I had no idea. I never told you, no." She was quiet for a long moment. The string lights above us swayed in a small gust of wind, but I never asked. We stood there at the railing, and the night was cold and clear, and the vineyard stretched away into darkness, and somewhere inside the hall the last of the music was playing. Something slow and winding down, the end of a long celebration. "Can I ask now?" she said. She looked at me steadily, the way she used to look at me when we were children, and she wanted something she was not sure I would give her, but she was going to ask anyway because she had decided it was worth trying. "About your life. About what it was. About what all those decorations mean." Her voice was not performing anything. It was only honest. I looked at my youngest sister, 7 years behind me and a whole world away, and I thought about the airport and the Sunday dinner and the phone call from a month ago. And I thought about the distance between people who love each other and never learn to cross it, and I thought about what it might mean to try. "Yes," I said. "You can ask." She nodded slowly. "Good." Her eyes were wet, but she was smiling, that easy Cooper smile that had always made strangers stop on the sidewalk. "Because I have a lot of questions." I smiled back. "So do I." She reached out and touched the 2 stars on my shoulder very lightly, the way my father had done earlier, as though she were touching something she was still learning was real. Then she said, "Before everyone leaves, I want a photograph. All of us by the windows, with you in the uniform." She said it firmly, with a directness that had always lived beneath her softness. I thought about the phone call a month ago, the request to leave the uniform at home. And I thought about how differently the evening had turned out from what anyone had planned. And I thought about how often the things we fear turn out to be exactly the things we needed. "All right," I said. The photographer gathered us near the tall windows that looked out over the Vineyard Hills. Cooper and Greg in the center, my parents on either side, and me standing with my officer's cap under my arm, the dress blues dark against the pale light, 2 silver stars on my shoulders. The photographer adjusted her camera and asked us all to get a little closer. My mother slid over until she was right beside me, and she looked up at the uniform, and she looked up at my face, and she said in a low voice that only I could hear, "You know, I have been telling Mrs. Henderson at church for years that my daughter is in the military." I looked down at her. Oh, she smoothed the front of her blue dress with both hands. "I think starting Monday, I'll tell her my daughter was a Marine general." She said it with the particular serenity of someone who has just discovered a new piece of information about herself and found it entirely satisfying. "Mom, does Mrs. Henderson know what a general is?" "She does not need to know what it means," my mother said. "She only needs to know it is impressive." I almost laughed. My father, standing on my other side, heard the exchange, and a small smile came across his face. He leaned close and said very quietly, "Your grandfather served 20 years in the army. He would have been out of his mind tonight." I felt something catch in my chest. "I know," I said. "The photographer told us to smile." The flash went off. 8 years have passed since that wedding in Charlottesville. I retired from the Marine Corps the following spring, 29 years of service completed. The responsibility passed to the next generation of Marines who will carry it forward with their own particular brand of excellence. My house is still in Jacksonville, North Carolina. I like hearing the helicopters some mornings. I like knowing the work continues even when I have stepped back from it. Retirement has not meant disappearing. Within a few months of leaving active duty, I began mentoring young officers at Camp Lejeune, speaking at leadership seminars, visiting high schools where students were trying to figure out who they wanted to become. Sometimes I sit across from a 17-year-old girl who reminds me of the girl I used to be, the one in the garage in Lima with the lawnmower part spread across the floor, and I tell her the truth about the road. It is hard, I tell them. It is long and it is hard, and there will be people who tell you it is not for you, and some of them will be people you love, but the hard roads are the ones that build you into something that lasts. One afternoon last spring, I was speaking to a group of junior officers at Lejeune, maybe 40 of them in a conference room, all of them sharp and attentive and carrying the particular energy of people who are still close enough to the beginning to remember why they started. They asked good questions about strategy and command and the mechanics of leadership under pressure. Then a young lieutenant at the back raised her hand and asked something different. "Ma'am, how do you lead well when the people closest to you don't understand what you do?" The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when a question has landed on something real. I thought about the Vineyard Hall, about 12 chairs scraping the floor, about my father at a railing in the dark. I said, "You lead the same way regardless. You lead with integrity, and you lead with consistency, and you lead as though the work matters because it does, whether or not the people watching understand its value." Understanding, I told her, has a way of arriving eventually. It does not always arrive on the schedule you would prefer, but it arrives. And when it does, it is better and more complete and more permanent than anything you could have forced. She wrote that down. A few others did too. My father calls every week now. It is one of the things that still catches me off guard, the simple fact of his voice on a Tuesday evening, asking me questions he should have asked 20 years ago. "What was your hardest deployment? How many Marines did you command at your peak? What does a general actually do with a day?" He listens carefully, the way a man listens when he knows he is making up for lost time. He keeps a small notebook by his chair, and Cooper told me once that he writes things down in it after we talk. She found it on his side table and saw his handwriting across the pages, her oldest daughter's life, written out in the measured cursive of a post office man who decided at 72 that it was not too late to learn. My mother discovered bragging. I do not say that unkindly. I say it with great affection, because the transformation has been remarkable in its completeness. At church, at the grocery store, at the dentist's office, at the hair salon, at every gathering large or small where conversation turns to family, Patricia Sullivan has one subject she returns to with the satisfaction of a person who has found exactly the right word for something she has been trying to say her whole life. My daughter was a Marine general, she says. Did I mention my daughter was a general? She does not wait to be asked. She raises it unprompted, in contexts where it does not strictly belong, with the confidence of a woman who has earned the right to say it by virtue of having waited 30 years to understand it. The first time she said it in front of me, I set down my coffee cup and looked at her, and she looked back at me with the expression of someone who has decided that a certain era of restraint is officially over. Cooper changed too. Her change was quieter and went deeper than any of the others. A year after the wedding, she began volunteering with a veteran support organization in Central Ohio, helping veterans and their families navigate the particular bureaucratic labyrinths that the country constructs and then leaves for veterans to untangle on their own. She uses her organizational skills and her warmth, which are both considerable, in service of people whose sacrifices she once did not fully understand. She calls me now every couple of weeks, and our conversations are different from anything we had before. She asks about the Marines I mentor. She asks about specific deployments, specific decisions. She asks me once on a cold February evening what I was thinking about in the hotel room the morning of her wedding before I got dressed. I thought about the uniform, I told her, what it meant to the people who wore it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I think I understand that better now. I believe her. In the living room of my parents' house in Lima, above the fireplace, there is a photograph in a dark wooden frame. It was taken by a wedding photographer in Virginia on a November evening 8 years ago. Copper and Greg stand in the center, lit by the warm light coming through the tall windows. My parents are on either side, my mother's hand on Cooper's arm, my father standing straight and still. And I am there too between my father and the window. In my Marine Corps dress blues, officer's cap under my arm, 2 silver stars on my shoulders. My father told me recently that it is the first thing every visitor notices when they walk into the room. They stop in the doorway and look at it, and then they look at my parents, and my parents look at each other with the expression of people who have finally gotten around to something they should have done a long time ago. Every time someone asks about the photograph, my mother says the same thing. That is our daughter, she says. The general. She says it simply and directly without preface or explanation, as though the sentence has always been there waiting, and she has only just now learned to say it out loud. There is something that I have thought about often in the years since that evening. Something that I try to explain when I speak to young Marines, or to young women who are trying to figure out what kind of life they are allowed to want. It is about the nature of understanding, and about the time it takes, and about what patience actually means when you are the one who is waiting. For a long time I believed that respect had to be demonstrated, proven, accumulated, displayed. That the way to be understood was to achieve enough that the achievement itself would do the explaining. And it is true that achievement matters. It is true that you earn what you earn and that there is no substitute for the work. But I have come to believe that there is something else operating beneath all of that. Something that does not move quickly and cannot be forced. And that is simply the slow and inevitable power of living with integrity long enough that eventually the truth becomes undeniable. I did not humiliate my family at Cooper's wedding. I did not go there to prove something or to punish anyone for the phone call, or for the 30 years before it. I went there because Cooper was my sister, and because she was getting married and because I would not miss it. And I wore the uniform because the uniform is who I am. And when 12 Marines rose to their feet in that hall, it was not because I had arranged anything or planned anything or wanted anything. It happened because it was true. It was simply true. And the room recognized it. That is how the greatest victories arrive, not with announcements. Not at moments of your choosing. They come quietly and completely, in rooms you did not design among people you did not expect. At the moment when you have stopped trying to make them happen and have simply become someone for whom they are inevitable. I have thought often about Kowalski, the man in the navy suit who stood up first. He did not know me. He had served under a Colonel Sullivan 12 years before that evening, and had no reason to expect to see her at his cousin's wedding in Virginia. He recognized 2 stars on his shoulder, did the calculation in a fraction of a second, and acted on what he knew to be true without hesitating and without asking permission. That is what training builds, not just the skill to act in difficult moments, but the reflex to honor what is real when you see it. My family did not have that training. They had years of polite distance, and a few letters they had not read carefully, and a general idea that Martha was doing something important somewhere far away. What happened that evening was not an embarrassment to them, and it was not a victory for me. It was simply a room full of people being honest at the same time, which is rarer than it should be and more powerful than almost anything else in the world. Not long ago, Cooper called to tell me that she had framed a copy of the wedding photograph for her own living room. She has it on the wall across from the front door, so it is the first thing she sees in the morning and the last thing she passes on the way out. She said she looks at it every day now, not with guilt, she told me firmly, but as a reminder that the people we love most are sometimes the people we understand least, and that it is never too late to close that distance if you are willing to cross it. I think that is about the best thing anyone has ever said to me. Better than any citation. Better than any commendation. Better than a room full of people rising to their feet. Though that was pretty good too. My father stood at a railing in a Virginia vineyard and said he was proud of me. Cooper touched the stars on my shoulder and asked if she could learn. My mother decided that the world needed to know her daughter was a general. These things happened not because I demanded them, but because I had lived for 29 years in a way that made them possible. I thought about the girl in the garage in Lima with her hands full of carburetor parts. I thought about the 19-year-old in the Quantico mud, running before dawn with lungs that felt like they were made of broken glass. I thought about every promotion announced to a family that said that is nice and every ceremony attended only by Marines, and every year that passed without a question from the people at home. I thought about all of it, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, that it had been exactly enough. The road was hard. It was supposed to be. The hard roads are the ones that lead somewhere. And sometimes, at the end of a long road, you find yourself standing in a vineyard hall in Virginia, while 12 people you barely know rise to their feet without being asked, and the room goes quiet, and the people who have known you longest finally see you clearly for the first time. And in that silence, everything makes sense. If someone in your life has walked a road no one else understood, tell them today that you are proud of them. Tell them clearly and specifically without waiting for the right moment, because the right moment has probably already passed and the next best one is right now. Those words do not expire, but time does, and some people have been waiting longer than you know.